Hello everybody, my name is Jatnos, and welcome to This Week in Mythic Plus. This week's affixes are Fortified, Grievous, Sanguine, of course Prideful, and this is also the first week in several weeks where we haven't received a set of hotfixes that impact dungeons, so this will be a little bit of a shorter episode than those last couple weeks, because there's really not too much unexpected this week compared to those last couple weeks. We did, of course, learn a lot over the past week. We learned about Valor points coming in. I've got a video of my initial reaction to that, which has stayed about the same. For those who don't know, they've announced that items earned now won't be upgradable through the Valor point system. I'm somewhat hopeful that they'll reconsider that one, because they kind of did the same thing with the Corruption Vendor, where they announced that you wouldn't be able to add corruption to old items that had been previously corrupted, and then cleanse their corruption, and then they were like, okay, we figured out how to make this work. My hope is that they'd consider doing that for the Valor points as well, because it seems a little dumb to have it not work that way, but even so, there's still, of course, good reason to do M+ this week and these next couple weeks. You still got your Great Vault, which is still better item levels than you can get out of the Valor point system. Again, for those who don't know, you can go check it out on Wowhead and stuff, the way the Valor point system is going to function. That is not what this video is about, though, because Valor points aren't here yet. They won't be here for another month or so. So, this week's affixes. We got the Grievous, we got the Fortified, we got the Sanguine. Mostly, it's going to be Grievous that's the affix that stops or that punishes the higher level groups. It's not going to punish them that much, though. It's a workable week for high level keystone pushing, like most of them actually are this season, especially with the Tyrannical nerfs. There are even a couple Tyrannical weeks now that are somewhat reasonable for groups to play. There's not really as many dead weeks as we've seen in previous expansions. Previous expansions, back in BFA, I remember Season 3 where there was like one good week and one okay week, and then 10 just like weeks that were so much worse by comparison for like medium to high level keys. This expansion, I don't think that you're really looking at that being the case at all. I think that most weeks are pretty good weeks. They're pretty, if you're trying to start going towards that Keystone Master achievement, because it seems like that's something that you can start doing now that'll be useful for those Valor points, that Valor point system as soon as it comes into play. This week is probably as good a week as any. If you look at MDT, it does seem like the MDT affixes here are a little wrong. I don't know if or when. I imagine this is something that will be fixed in the very, very near future. There are a lot of good weeks coming up in which you can do this. Next Tyrannical week here, Raging, Quaking, Tyrannical. It's okay. The Raging is a little bit tricky, because on a Tyrannical week you'd want to pull big, but then Raging is there, so I mean it's still a fine week. The real moneymaker for the really high level key pushers is going to be this week in 2 weeks' time, the Bursting Volcanic Fortified week. That's going to be the one where you see really high keys done. That's probably where you'll see. If you don't see the first 26 done this week, you will see it that week, would be my guess. Maybe even higher, I'm not sure. And then we get to a couple nastier weeks. So we're in for starting last week and going these next couple weeks, we're in for a pretty good couple of weeks for high key pushing. For mid-level keys, these affixes here again, they're wrong. It's going to be Sanguine, Grievous. For mid-level keys, I would say that this week is going to be a lot about Sanguine and a lot of different keys. Because actually a lot of different dungeons on this lineup have these narrow corridors, these areas where Sanguine can get you in trouble. I would say the other side, not so much halls, a little bit in mists, quite a bit in Plaguefall, a lot in Sanguine Depths, a little bit in Spires, a lot in Theater, and not too bad in Necrotic Wake. So like 4.5, 5 of the dungeons I would say are ones where Sanguine management is heavily tested on your tank and potentially on the rest of your group. So go into these dungeons with a focus on that. Go into these dungeons with health potions ready. Aggressive use of health potions to get yourself up out of Grievous whenever your healer's under a lot of pressure is, I think, going to be a really important thing for all players this week. It's one thing that I think that both tanks and DPS players can do to improve is anytime you're worried about whether you're in danger of dying to a mechanic or not, a lot of people will look at their health bar and make a decision based on what's happening at their health bar and what the mechanics are. But I think one factor that not enough people do take into account that's especially amplified on a Grievous week is what the health bars of your group is looking like. Because if I'm at 50% health, but the rest of my group is at 100% health, it's pretty bad for me to generally pop a health stone. Whether I'm playing tank or DPS, that's generally true, right? Because your healer can just focus on you. But if you're at 50% health, and the rest of your group is also at 50% health, and there's damage going out, that's when it's time for you to consider, all right, one of two things is going to happen here, right? My healer has cooldowns running, and we're fine, or my healer doesn't have cooldowns running, and I really need to help out. So that'd be my advice for people this week, is think about your defensives in the context of how your group's health is looking, because on Grievous weeks, your healer can really fall behind based on all the members of your group, so try not to be a part of that. Try and be somebody where whenever there's pressure on multiple points in the group, that is when you use your abilities to reduce the pressure. Anyways, that's been a lot of rambling, somewhat related to the week in Mythic Plus, which is what the video's ostensibly about. Let's go dungeon by dungeon real quick. This week is the one where I've made the fewest changes to the routes from previous weeks. I got a couple comments actually in the YouTube video wondering why I make even new routes every week. And historically it's been really historically it was because last expansion we had these affixes that fundamentally changed every week. This expansion, with the exception of bolstering weeks, there's really not a need to use different routes week to week. So the main reason I have continued to make the routes every single week has been A, to update them based on new things that I've learned, and also B, there are some weeks still that you would want to change your pathing. This week's not really one of them. There are a couple of pulls that you'd maybe want to adjust based on Sanguine. There are maybe a couple pulls that you could really get away with in big pulls on really easy weeks that maybe this week either does or doesn't qualify for that threshold, but really the kind of groups that are making those decisions, these routes aren't aimed for. That's a cut above where these routes are going. And this week, I haven't been able to find, I've looked through all the routes, haven't been able to find really anything that needed to change for this week. So, they are basically the same as last week. So there's a handy, if you have last week's ones, you can just use those. The only thing that's updated this week is I went through them, messed around with some of the notes, updated some information on some of the notes, but basically no pulls are different. So let's go dungeon by dungeon, and we can talk about, now finally start the dungeon by dungeon bit. We can talk about what's going on in each of these dungeons. So the other side, this one is one that is somewhat a pain in a couple spots for Sanguine management. You need to be really careful in this area, especially these mobs, they run away and they don't stop running away. And you gotta be careful about them running and bathing into some Sanguine. So this corridor, and of course the mech gun, I would say the mech gun wing is the one where these pulls in particular, you can get yourself into some Sanguine trouble. So be careful of those. Of course, be careful in this area about the affix as well. And yeah, be ready for, it's still a tricky dungeon even with those extra 2 minutes. Even on Fortified, these bosses can be tough with Grievous. So, this fight, for instance, when you're on your platform all by yourself without a healer, you really got to think proactively, because if you're at 70% and you can heal yourself up above Grievous, that's going to be really valuable, because if you don't do it, you're going to keep ticking down, and you're going to be at 40% with 4 stacks when you get back to the main platform. And your healer's going to get a big haste buff, but potentially they might need all their mana depending on what kind of key level you're on. Alright, Halls of Atonement. This is theoretically a great Sanguine dungeon. In practice, you can get yourself in these situations where you're doing these pulls in artificially confined spaces. One pull that I used to have in the route, for instance, was jumping down here from after this pull and fighting these guys in this area, and that sort of pull is always really sketch because on a Sanguine week, because you've got such a narrow space, right? You've got this wall on this side, and then you have these hostile pulls on the other sides of you, and of course there's a wall on this side, so you're boxed in. So try to avoid doing that this week. Whether or not you lift my route, be very careful about jumping down here. Be very careful about managing your play area in this part of the dungeon, such that you aren't going to be in a position where you are unable to drop good Sanguine puddles because you have no space to move. It's very avoidable here, but it's something that you actually do need to actively think and make sure you're not getting yourself in a position where, a patrol is going to cut off your escape plan behind you, and then you're stuck in a catch-22 with the Sanguine. This is Tirna Scithe. The main things you're going to watch out for in this area is there are nasty mobs that like to bathe in Sanguine. We got casters, particularly these Tirna villagers. You're only going to pull one of them. You're only going to pull this one, but it is extremely prone to spending 5 seconds in a Sanguine Puddle if you allow it to, so try to avoid that happening. Common strategies here are either you can be just moving as all the mobs are dying, or you can knock the other mobs away as they're dying, such that they don't drop Sanguine under the Tirna villager. That'll save you a bit of time. Not going to be the end of the world, probably, in this dungeon if something heals. The timer is extremely favorable, but it is something to look out for. It's something to be aware of. Also in the maze area, depending on which pathway you get, there are some mobs similarly in this area that like to stand still and cast in their friends' Sanguine Puddles. It's normally good practice in this area anyways to be pretty good at killing everything around the same time, but just be on the lookout for that. Make sure that if there are any casters, those are dying at the same time or slightly ahead of where the melee mobs in the pack are dying. Plaguefall. So Plaguefall Sanguine is extremely technically intensive in this area. This is an area of the dungeon that can make or break your run on any week, but with Sanguine active, you have to be really, really, really careful because obviously you want the mobs to get low on health. You want them to help explode and kill the other stuff. But if something is Sanguine healing, that's actually going to compete with the damage of the Plague Borers and be a big problem for you. And once that happens once, you're not going to have a second Plague Borer for round 2. So try to avoid anything going wrong with Sanguine in this area. I don't know, it's tough. If you can, my advice is overuse your anti-Sanguine abilities, because if you use them correctly, these pulls are going to last 10 or 15 seconds, right? Because everything's going to die to the Plague Borer. So don't worry about saving cooldowns for later in the pull, because if you use the cooldowns correctly, there won't be a later in the pull. Of course, you will need some for the next pull, so don't be too aggressive with them. But if you can do something to prevent something Sanguine healing, even if it's somewhat costly to do so, it's going to save you a lot of time in the long run in this area because the mobs will die to themselves if you play the Sanguine correctly. Also be aware that these little things drop Sanguine, so don't get caught out by that. It's something I see. These are among those mobs that intuitively a lot of people assume that they don't get affected by on-death affixes because they're worth 1 account, they have no health, but you pull 16 of them at a time, that kind of stuff. But for some reason they do trigger on-death affixes, so be aware of that. Don't get caught out by it. Sanguine Depths, adequately named dungeon. Do you guys know there's 2 dungeons this expansion that have an affix name in their title? There's Sanguine Depths and Necrotic Wake. That's a fun fact. What's not fun is the Sanguine affix in the Sanguine Depths. That's a cruel joke that they are playing on us with this dungeon name. So you're going to want to be really careful with how you're moving stuff as it's dying. Some of the hardest pulls in this dungeon early in the area, Regal Mistdancers have a natural kind of area denial where their Echoing Thrust is going to keep echoing at all the previous locations it's been cast, which means that you can kind of naturally get into this problem where you move in one direction, and then there's Sanguine behind you and Echoes in front of you or whatever, and you've got nowhere good to keep moving with that pack. So I don't know, plan ahead. Don't get yourself in a position where you're going to run into a wall and run out of space when you're handling these packs. If you can, pulling stuff through here, getting the entire group on the other side, and then running forward rather than running back will save you time. Even if both strategies would work equally well, that means that you're walking forward in the dungeon rather than walking backwards. That means less travel time. So whenever possible, trying to, as a DPS player, or particularly as if you can get all your DPS and healer players to do this, when you start a pull, getting on the other side of it relative to your tank can be really helpful for good movement throughout this dungeon. That's just generally a pretty useful thing to do if you can, but it's especially valuable in Sanguine Week because your tank is going to want to kite stuff as it's dying, and with pulls like this where the DPS players are going to want to run away from it as the tank is kiting as well, because there's frontals or whatever, you want to keep moving in the same direction as each other, make that direction forward in the dungeon rather than backwards. A couple of other tricky pulls in this area. This one here, so this one's the one where you tag this Venthyr Lantern. You can either do this, you can split this up if you want, but if you do want to tag the Venthyr Lantern, you can fight this pack in this room and they'll be in range of the lantern. You do need to be careful as stuff is dying to manage the Sanguine while doing that as well. So I would try and start this right in the very corner and then kite this way out and around potentially, or kite this way out, ideally kill everything around the same time. but make sure that you're going to have stuff die while within the Venthyr Lantern, or don't bother combining the pulls together necessarily. If you're going to need to use the entire space, it is maybe better to just kill this pack and then go handle these guys and get more value out of your Sanguine, or out of your Venthyr Lantern. If you're a Venthyr player, don't have a Venthyr player, don't worry about it. Obviously, it's good, but it's good to have a Venthyr player in this dungeon. But obviously, not every group has them. They're a rare covenant relative to the Fae and the Kyrian, so not every group does have them. Rest of the dungeon, I mean, yeah, it's nasty all the way through with Sanguine. Be aware, in this area, the cadets do drop Sanguine. Most of the other mobs in this area do not drop Sanguine, but the Sanguine cadets cleverly have Sanguine in the name, so that's how you can remember it. They drop Sanguine. All right, Spires of Ascension. This one, it's not the. So this is one of the ones where the Sanguine difficulty is basically entirely on your tank in this dungeon. I mean, that's kind of true everywhere, but here in particular, with good placement of where the previous packs are dying, and good management of good thinking ahead of how you're going to make sure that the archers and stuff aren't planted where there's about to be Sanguine. Good use of stuff like Sigils of Chains, Death Grips, Typhoons, whatever, any sort of ability like that is going to be really valuable for keeping these mobs out of Sanguine, or damage prioritizing your damage into those targets as a first priority, the things that are harder to move for your tank. Can't usually afford to do that because usually you just got to kill what you got to kill. And you can't let Sanguine necessarily adjust your priorities in a dungeon like this. So, yeah, do what you can. That's tough. Necrotic Wake. This one, you're kind of home free once you've managed the Sanguine in this area. You're kind of home free. Depends a little bit on your plan in this area, but other than that, I mean, Sanguine. It's not too restrictive, right? There's usually you have quite a bit of space depending on what your pulls are going to be. With the pathing I have here, the main way you're going to get in trouble in this dungeon is if you're forced to pull something and then there's like a patrol running close by that you're not supposed to pull. It's like this can potentially be that kind of problem for you here. That's when Sanguine can start to be an affix that really punishes you. But for the most part, my pathing doesn't really feature that in this dungeon. A lot of paths do that though, so. And you may well want to use one of those. And if you do, just be aware of it. Be cognizant of your positioning. Make sure that you're not setting yourself up for, if you can't. So if you're playing a spec that can, distract, trap, entangling roots, anything like that, a patrol leader, firing that off in advance on a patrol leader to stop it getting near you when stuff is about to die can really make sure that you still have the space to kite. That kind of thinking ahead as a non-tank player generally. Even a couple tanks have abilities in their kit that do this as well. Can be really, really, really helpful. So look for opportunities to do that. Particularly if your route has you hugging walls and fighting stuff in narrow areas while patrols are passing by. All right, Theater of Pain. This dungeon, my plan here is basically the same as I expect it will be the entirety of the Prideful season. Prideful has these interesting effects where there's a lot of cool ways to play it in theory, and in practice it does kind of get drilled down to a couple of, I don't know, meta strategies that kind of make sense and become pretty resistant to change. And so my preferred pathing in the route, it's called the With Skips route, but that basically the theater doesn't really offer traditional skips, except for it, unless you want to start getting really, really advanced. So the With Skips route is the same one that we've had for the last couple weeks, where you go Zav, then you do the first two pulls in Gore Chop, and you go Kultharok, and then you go Gore Chop, and that gets you Pride into every boss. Whereas the Without Skips route is just Zav, Kultharok, Gore Chop, and that means you don't get Pride onto Kultharok, but you do get him onto the other two bosses. And it's pretty hard to imagine deviating much from that kind of core idea in this dungeon of getting Pride onto 2 or 3 of these bosses, doing anything weirder. I don't know. It's something that'll be hard for me to make that adjustment to the pathing. I don't know. You might have a preferred way of doing this instead, but for me, it's the kind of thing where it's an affix that makes it so that making like small tweaks to the route, it's not really something you can do, right? Because a change in like a slight change here implies that you're going to entirely change the pathing or the prideful timings, and so you kind of need to rework the entire thing ahead of it. So changing one decision, like going from left to right here potentially, could cascade through the rest of the pathing. Yeah, that's not really particularly relevant for this week, but those are my musings on Theater of Pain. In practice this week, you're looking at Sanguine dropping being important. One area that can be a problem is potentially when you're fighting Shackled Souls. Just be careful with where you're fighting them. Manage your space in the area well. Manage your Sanguine in this area well. Manage it down here. I don't know, the affix's good. It's tricky, particularly this area, I would say, is among the trickier. So maybe pull this pack back up a little bit, and then you have a little bit more space to fight the next pack. And the gas bag already denies a lot of area, right? So if you've got Sanguine denying you more of your area, that's even more of a challenge. Again, you can get yourself in this rough position where if you start kiting the gas bag back and there's Sanguine behind you, that can be bad. The good news is Sanguine goes away after 20 seconds, so it really would have to be stuff you're fighting at the same time as the gas bag that are causing Sanguine problems for you, because even the previous pull's Sanguine's probably going to be gone by the time you'd get near it. So you don't have to be as careful in this area as it may seem, but you do need to be a little bit careful, and it's the kind of thing where if you start combining pulls, you're going to need to start being really careful and really aware of what's happening as the mobs are dying. Alright, those are the dungeons. I guess maybe not necessarily a shorter video this week after all, because I rambled about a bunch of random stuff. So I don't know. Hope you liked this video. Sorry if you didn't. I guess if you didn't, you're probably gone by now. So I guess not sorry. Check out my Twitch stream, twitch.tv/ratnos, where I stream once a year whenever we do raid re-clears. I was trying to stream more often. I've been bad about it the last couple weeks, taking some time. Just hang out, play video games by myself. But I'm gonna start making some new YouTube videos more than just this weekly series and the Titanforge podcast and stuff. So look forward to new content unless I get really lazy and decide not to do it. And thanks everyone for watching. Hit like and subscribe and stuff. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.